what the biggest pandemic is today in our digital lives? No, it's not COVID, it's fake news. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Digital Citizenship webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about, you guessed it, fake news. The first definition is the word disinformation. Now, disinformation is when somebody specifically creates false news to try to deceive you. That's called disinformation. Misinformation, on the other hand, is when somebody spreads this false news, maybe not to deceive you. In fact, maybe they think that they are doing you a favor. So here's one quick way to think about it. If you are thinking about disinformation, you're thinking about someone who is purposefully telling a false story. They probably have a reason for that story, but they want to deceive you in some way. Misinformation, on the other hand, is when you're in a WhatsApp group and somebody forwards you something that they say, this may or may not be true. That is the spread of misinformation. So you need to know about both disinformation and misinformation if we want to stop the spread of fake news. Now, did you know that there are actually 3 different types of fake news? And I'm going to tell you about them right now. So the first kind of fake news is called false stories. These are stories that are completely false. The second kind is called a half-truth. There's some amount of truth, maybe they're twisting a story a little bit. This is called a half-truth. And the third one is called clickbait. And those, I'm sure you've seen plenty of those when you're on the internet. I'm going to talk about all of these right now. So let's go back and talk about false stories. Have you ever seen a story about an alien who came from Mars to the US? That is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about false stories. But sometimes these false stories have very large repercussions. In fact, did you know that in the US, in the early days of the pandemic, a man died when he took a medicine that he had heard was a cure for COVID? This is one of the tragic consequences of false stories that are spread. And there are all kinds of false stories, and there are all kinds of reasons that people spread false stories. When you're teaching this topic to children, you can easily find false stories in your locality, in the news today, and you can ask them, how would they go about validating whether this is a true story or whether this is a false story? And in a little bit, I'm going to share some tips and tricks with you on exactly how to do that. Now, the second kind of fake news is called a half-truth. This is when there's some amount of truth, but maybe it's twisted to serve a higher purpose or serve a nefarious purpose in some cases. For example, recently, I was forwarded an article about 3 doctors from Canada who had all died. They all worked at the same hospital. They all died in relatively quick succession. Now, the way this story came across was that these doctors suddenly died, and in fact, they had just had their COVID booster right before they died. Well, when you do some research and you find out and you read what the hospital actually published about these doctors, it turns out that most of them, 2 of the 3 of them, their deaths were not sudden. In fact, one man was suffering from cancer, and he had been suffering from cancer for quite some time. The other was equally ill for quite a period of time. But somebody wanted to spread a story that said, please don't take your COVID booster, and hence a half-truth story was told. You can see how these might have really bad impacts, especially if people are reading these stories and they're not thinking critically, right? So, what are the couple of things that you can do and that you can tell your students that they can do to combat these kinds of fake news? The first one is do research. The first thing you can do is, if you hear a story, see if other news outlets are reporting the same story. Is this story being told consistently across all of the news outlets? Secondly, examine, is this news outlet really a trustworthy news site? Maybe it's a satirical site. Maybe it's even a site that's known for spreading fake news. All of these are important to check when you're trying to get to the bottom of whether a story is a real story or a fake news story. The other thing that you can do is that there are fact-checking websites out there. In fact, both Z News and Times of India have their own fact-checking websites. We'll provide the links in the box below. There are plenty of worldwide fact-checking resources as well. So if something sounds too good to be true, or if it plays into a narrative that you think somebody wants to push forward, you might want to check it out. And a fact-checking website is a great way to do so. Now, the third kind of fake news that we have is called clickbait. These are the ones that have outrageous claims. They start their headlines with unbelievable, epic, shocking. They promise you miracle cures, they promise you fast money, and yes, they promise you a little bit of gossip about one of your favorite stars. But in the end, who's really benefiting from this clickbait? Some advertiser. If you've ever noticed, and if you ever click on one of those stories, some shocking truth about this particular actor or actress, and then you go and you read the article, there's actually nothing very shocking. Or maybe you already heard it and it was 5 years ago that somebody said that about that particular person. However, some advertiser somewhere is getting money just because you clicked that link. And they prey on the children and the naive in particular. So it's really important that when you're talking about clickbait to students, that you let them know, hey, when you see these kinds of things that play upon your curiosity, that make you dying to know what the next part of the sentence is, it's a pure clickbait and it's to be avoided. There's no reason that we should be sending money to these advertisers for these silly and ridiculous headlines that they're putting all around the world. Now, I'm gonna take a minute here. I'd like to ask you to pause the video because I have a video that I want you to watch. It's gonna talk about the 5 C's, which is one way that you can introduce how to debunk fake news in your classroom. So take a pause here, check the link below, and I'll catch you on the other side. So what did you think about the 5 C's? Do you remember what they are? There's content, there's credibility, there's construction, there's corroboration, and there's compare. There were a lot of tips in there about comparing to other websites, checking the content of the website that this is on, that you can have and construct classroom discussion with your students about how can they check. Here are a few other tips that you might want to think about. Number 1, did you know that even photographs can be used in fake news stories? I don't know if you've ever heard, but I've seen instances where a photograph from 5 years ago shows up in a completely different story, maybe even from a different part of the world. Well, actually, Google has an image search capability, and I'm gonna link a video in the chat box below where you can go and you can find out how to check where else a photograph has been used in what other news stories to see if that photograph is real or not. So the next time you see a photograph with someone standing next to an alien, you can check to see where that photograph really came from. So there's a great United Nations campaign that I urge you to check out. It's called #PledgeToPause. And the idea is that before you hit that share button or before you hit that forward button, that you critically think about what it is that you're about to share. The campaign has a simple mantra. There are 5 questions: who, what, where, when, and why. Okay? Please take a look, and I think this is a great way to teach your kids how to think about fake news and how to analyze it critically. So, in terms of our CBSE Skills subject, Digital Citizenship, I have 3 lessons to share with you all about fake news. In the grade 6 curriculum, you can check out lesson number 15, which is all about clickbait. In the grade 7 curriculum, you can check out lesson number 15 as well. This one is about critically analyzing the news. And in grade 8, you can check out lesson 10. All of these are talk about the various elements of fake news and give you some ideas about how you can engage your students and have a discussion around clickbait, around half-truths, and around false stories. So please do check it out. Now that I've done this, what's next? Well, it's very simple. I have a quick quiz for you. 5 questions to make sure you understood all about fake news. You'll feel much more confident in teaching it when you are sure that you know what you're talking about. So please check out the quiz in the link below. The next thing is take this lesson or any of the lessons of digital citizenship to 40 of your students. Have a discussion with them. Fake news really is the pandemic of our times, and it's so important that kids know what is and what isn't real. And then you can upload your work at the link provided in the box below. So I hope you feel much more educated about fake news. Stay tuned for our next webinar, and I'll see you on that side. Bye-bye.